This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's the place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street.
Well, good afternoon, folks. We're really pleased that you're joining us here this afternoon. We have a very interesting guest that has been, as they say on the street, rode hard and put up wet, okay? And she has she's had some seriously difficult problems, but she's going to tell us how she fought her way out of a very difficult set of life circumstances, including, and this is an important one because a lot of this is going to be about brain injury. And she's going to talk in great detail about traumatic growth experiences. You know, what happens is we're so interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, but she's talking about post-traumatic growth, and she's had a number of different traumas from a number of different perspectives. So with that, we're going to ask to Heidi. I should have really gotten the pronunciation of your name first. I know it's Heidi. Is it Siefkas?
Correct.
I got it.
Spot on.
Okay, I practiced a little on my own, but I didn't know if that was right, and I meant to ask you that. So Heidi, where are you from now?
I'm originally from a small town in Wisconsin, but I now call two places home. South Florida, where I am talking to you, as well as the sunny island of Kauai.
Yes, we're not jealous.
I had a feeling you would be not so sympathetic to those two places.
No, it's great. You got two beautiful parts of the world, and we were out in Hawaii about 3 years ago. It was a wonderful experience. I won't go into that. So let's go in and take a moment. What has happened is Heidi has written a book. She's talked about these issues. She's on YouTube. Let's talk a little more about what exactly was the traumatic event that changed your life, Heidi. Could you tell us about it?
Absolutely, and press rewind to the fall of 2009. At that point in time, I was living in South Florida, but I was living a very different and busy career. I was juggling a lot of balls. A VP of the travel industry, so I was globetrotting from Berlin one week to LA the next, taking a red eye back to Orlando for an expo. I was happily married to a Brazilian chef, a homeowner, keeping up with the Joneses here in South Florida, and very healthy. Then on one of those travels, I ended up in the Northeast, in Hudson River Valley, New York, which actually reminded me very much of my small town in the Midwest. And I did something as mundane as taking out the trash. It was the fall color change, and I decided to take out the trash and take a stroll. I went out of the building, turned the corner, and the next thing I remember was waking up in the ICU 5 days later.
Wow. So you were just taking out the trash was there a storm? What happened with that situation?
It was a normal Sunday. No abnormally strong winds, no rain. It was a beautiful Sunday to take a stroll and then perhaps go back inside and watch the New England Patriots.
Wow. And so so then what happened? How did you wind up in the emergency? How did you wind up in the hospital where you were recovering from being knocked unconscious? What happened?
Well, it's a good thing that I am slightly addicted to my iPhone, because I put that on my hip of my pants as I left. And when I didn't appear for an hour or so, my husband called that cell phone, and an ER doctor answered the phone instead of myself. The ER doctor let my husband know what had happened to me. And what had happened is that a 1,000-pound tree limb, a 1,000-pound tree limb struck me as I took out the trash and the last night's pizza box, and left me unconscious in the driveway with a broken C7 vertebra and a boatload of other injuries.
Wow. And you were, it's amazing that it happened with no natural events? I mean, I did read a little bit about it, but that was the first question that came to my mind because it didn't make any sense. You're just out doing the trash. If she was out there and it was a storm and there were lightning bolts and thunder, so on and so forth, but just out of the blue, boom. Now, was it a whole tree? It was a limb.
It was a limb. The remaining tree still stands to this day, but this was one healthy part of a tree, still very much alive. I didn't have the ability to move it with various other people, even 9 months later when I thankfully recovered. It was huge. I cringed the first time I saw it. Wow. Almost 2 months after the accident happened.
So then what happened in your recovery? And you had some surgery then, is that right?
Yes. My C7 vertebra was fractured and neurosurgery was imminent, with a prognosis not knowing, if I would fully recover or only partially. But a week and a half after the accident, I underwent neurosurgery, and then I was introduced to my companion for the next 5 to 6 months. And that companion was a Miami JTO brace. Now,
what's that?
Everyone says, isn't that ironic that you were wearing a Miami article since you were living in South Florida, but the accident happened in New York? And, well, I think it's kind of ironic, but also it sounds like it's a sexy sports car that I'd be driving on South Beach, not a full neck, torso, collar, and back brace called a Miami JTO. And it isn't sexy and it wasn't fast or sporty. It was exactly the opposite. Yeah. It was a torturous cage, if you will, that kept me immobile so that my bone could fuse, and that now I can say I can go and do adventures that would be a little bit more suiting than taking out the trash for the accident that happened.
So you could actually travel. Could you travel with that? I mean, it sounded like you were pretty limited after that for many months because of that brace. Is that true?
I was under travel restrictions, so there wasn't going to be an airplane ride or train ride home. I was going to recover living in the Northeast. The brace was very limiting. It was uncomfortable to sit in a car. It was uncomfortable to really sit or lie. It puts you in a position that you're probably familiar with when you ride in that uncomfortable row next to the bathrooms in the airplanes, that the seat does not recline and that you are in that forced upright locked position. That was me for 5.5 months.
Wow.
And no showers, mind you. And that was a very hard blow to the ego. Everyone says, how could showers be that big of a deal? It is. When you're in your mid-30s and getting a sponge bath in not the way that you envisioned them, but by a nurse or your mother, it was a challenge, if you will.
It sounds unpleasant. It sounds terrible. So when you were in that semi-frozen state, when you were locked down, what happened with the rest of your life? Because if it was 7 months, a lot got placed on hold. When you're a woman who's been literally flying around the world, all of a sudden you're 7 months out of commission. What happened?
Well, that old adage of bad things happen in threes, well, that also was the case in my life, and that tree had a ripple effect that didn't only cause physical loss and trauma, but also that high-powered career, they needed to move on with their initiatives, and they weren't going to wait 7 months or 9 months for someone to recover. So I received the news that I was going to be forced to resign from that job, and that professional part of my life was part of my identity. But the hardest blow was that I found out that my marriage had disintegrated. Even before the tree hit, just the day before, I had entered into knowing that my husband had been living a double life for nearly a year before all this happened. So in simultaneous collisions, all these losses happened, and I felt that I had lost everything that I held dear that fall.
So you had not only a physical brain injury or neck injury with a concussion, which would have been a brain injury, and a neck injury.
Absolutely.
Then you also had seriously traumatic psychic injuries with the job that you loved. You could see that you loved travel, and that was taken away from you. And then your husband, and you had some inkling of it, but then the reality of the situation came stalking in your door when you actually had to stop and think about it.
It was the opportunity to have everything on pause that was, I would say, the gift of this tragic event, was that any one of those things alone, with everything else continuing, maybe would have been a little too much clutter to really pay attention and reflect on the opportunity. But because everything, and I mean social calendar, anything that you have on your plate, going to the gym or work meetings, all of that stopped, and I had to only focus on my health.
So what would be some of the tools that our listeners could use? We have listeners out there that have hit the fan like this, maybe not as badly as you've hit the fan, but the issue is, what are the tools you began to devise? I mean, you're a strong person. I haven't met a traveler that travels a lot who is not a strong person, who isn't used to dealing with the adversity of change in their lives. I mean, it just happens. I used to fly a lot, and we'd see people completely flipping out over the fact that it was raining in Seattle or whatever, and the plane couldn't make it. So you're a traveler, and you've experienced a lot of change and a lot of difficulties in your life, and you're pretty accustomed to it. What tools did you use to get past this once you began to settle with it? How did you begin to fight your way out of it?
Well, after having quite a few pity parties, and I would also say adult temper tantrums, because I can't say that I had this happen and poof, I was able to deal with it. I had to grieve and vent. But once I started to rekindle my power to tap into perspective and understand that I had a choice, not necessarily about what happened to me, but how I would frame it. And I started to think about how this could change my life, chart my course in a different way. And I did have an opportunity to rebuild that former life, but given 9 months to reflect, I decided to architect a new one, a better one, in fact.
Wow. So what, again, I'm getting a little specific, but because you just said some important things there that I think a lot of people are listening for out there, and that is what happens when you're down, you're out, you've had your pity party, you've had some grieving, you realize your personal life is going to change dramatically across the board. And you said something I think very important, and that is you began to develop a different perspective. You began to kind of get out of your own box, as it were, and look at yourself from a distance. Over on our side of the business, we call it metacognition. You were thinking about the way you were thinking. And so what happens, you began to look at yourself, and somewhere in there is where the transformational process began. Could you highlight a little bit more about how that began to take place in your own mind and your own self-observations?
I actually created a mantra for my process, and it was a way for me to shift my perspective in just a moment. And it's called Look Up, and it has a double meaning to it. And you already know the backstory that if I was looking up, I may have seen 1,000-pound tree limb coming down. So there's a little comedy in this mantra, but it's one to remind you to look up, to be aware, to be in the moment, So maybe not juggling all those balls or reacting to everything, but just being mindful. And then that second component of lookup that I use is to spin each situation positively. So I had 3 different things that necessarily were not positive, but they were opportunities. They also, some caused wounds, but in the end, they created a very interesting type of wisdom that I hope resonates with your listeners.
Well, it sounds a little bit meditative. I mean, it's a spiritual transformation process. You then you may have been a spiritual person before, but this is a different kind of, if you forgive the psychiatric expression, self-actualization mixed with spirituality, where you're really going to do something with yourself from a more transcendent perspective. Is that true?
Absolutely. I would say it is meditation, and I think each person can find their secret sauce or their secret recipe to meditation. And in my case, it started out being walking. I wasn't able to return home, but I could walk, and being in 4 walls that allowed me to think during my process. It's almost as if I was walking a labyrinth. Then I started realizing I could do this without even walking. I could do it by just doing the labyrinth in my head and creating the thoughts that I wanted in this life moving forward.
Okay, now let me stop you right there, because I think then you're talking a little bit. Now, forgive me for using my terminology.
That's okay.
But okay. I'm trying to help readers, our listeners, conceptualize what's going on. But it sounds a little bit like guided imagery. Like you began to envision yourself. It may not have been a labyrinth per se, but you envisioned yourself, I'm guessing, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, moving into different realities and moving through different realities successfully in a guided imagery kind of way. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then you really then were envisioning yourself in a healing process.
Absolutely.
And you were taking yourself into wellness by imagining yourself, just as a pole vaulter for the Olympics would do before he goes to the Olympics, imagining going over that bar at whatever, 18 feet or whatever. You have to be there in your mind before you can get there in reality.
And I was imagining myself in a cocktail dress, not wearing my cage, if you will, as well as feeling once again, South Florida warmth while I was in New York through a very blustery winter, I might add.
So you had a couple of different things that you just said. Yeah, they were sensory experiences, even though you may have been locked down in bed. One is how you looked. The other one was the temperature.
Yes.
And then you, on a visual level, imagining where you were and the surroundings, in a healthy place, in a balanced place, having some fun, as opposed to being beat up by the situation.
Correct.
So then, how did you actually then, when you did that, did you begin, to experience changes? Could you tell us about how you began to see those changes happen within yourself?
I guess all of that led up to my homecoming, which meant that I was physically well enough to now not be with a neurosurgeon and to now go back to my home in South Florida. So as the insides of myself were healing well enough and the bone was fusing and no more brain swelling and bleeding, I knew that also the other parts of me were starting to heal. They were probably behind some of the physical stuff, but when I returned to South Florida with a fused C7 spine or a vertebra, I then was able to start dealing with some of the other things that were on my plate, if you will. And those had to do with mental health and understanding what I was going to do with my marriage. Was I going to work on it, or was I going to say, this is something that is no longer a part of my life, as well as what I was going to do professionally. And all of those are components of your life that demanded reflection.
And some decisions. You had to make
Absolutely.
some serious decisions. So you were beat up, confused, knocked out, using some guided imagery, but you still, in the end, had to make those real decisions about the reality of your life when you re-entered the reality of your life.
And the reality of my life is I walked through the same door that I had exited 5.5 months prior. Everything looked the same, smelled the same, but I was not the same. One, physically I wasn't the same, but also the soul or the person that walked through that door was different as well. I was triumphant, but I didn't necessarily know what the end product would be.
So then you had to start making one decision at a time from this new internal persona.
Yes.
So you just started making one decision at a time. So the outcome of that was you made some specific decisions. Now, we're on a podcast, but I think that some of this has been covered in your book, so I don't want to get too personal with you. And I haven't read your book. I'm looking forward to reading it, because it sounds like a book that people should read who have been through this kind of thing, because it turns out being positive without being blatantly positive. It's really kind of a how to recover from multiple tragedies from the perspective of really changing your view of your life. So what decisions did you then begin to make? Did you get a divorce, or what happened?
I eventually decided to get a divorce, and no one gets married to get divorced.
Yeah.
And I thought once I made that decision that would be it, okay? But the entire process is painful, even if you are the one that wants the divorce. And by having many friends, family, or who I call my clan around me, it made that bearable. But mind you, at the same time, I'm starting actual physical rehabilitation. I now have a fused vertebra, but my back and arms and neck and torso have been held together with a false skeleton for 5.5 months, so my muscles had atrophied. So I was going through physical PT during this time and going through a divorce. I had no idea that PT was so painful, nor that a divorce would be so painful. Coming out the other end of both of those things, I then needed to decide, okay, what am I going to do professionally? And I decided at that point in time that I would not return to such a grueling schedule in the travel industry, that there needed to be another way that I could reach people and continue to travel, but in a different fashion.
So I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. I've got this other burning question that's coming up while I'm talking to you, going through this process and picturing your agony. A quick medical question.
Yes.
Was part of the physical therapy and that business with getting yourself back into range of motion, that sort of thing, was massage a part of that?
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, I did a little bit of everything. I did chiropractic, I did physical therapy, I did acupuncture, massage, electrodes, and a component of everything that I did was seeing a neurologist and another team that were working on the physical stuff, but also a mental health specialist at the same time, because there was a lot going on here. It wasn't just physical, there was a lot of emotions to deal with, whether it was pain, loss of a marriage, or the trauma.
So then what did you do professionally after you got through that? I know you're a writer, you're an author.
Yes.
I said one book early on, but I know you've got two out there.
Yes.
And we are going to have those listed in the show notes. The title is right out of my head. I can tell you what the link is that I put up there. It's the word drop is significant.
Yes.
So
The first book is When All Balls Drop.
Right. When all the balls drop. Ouch. And what was the second book, Heidi?
The second book is called With New Eyes.
Well, that's interesting. So you got the trauma and you got the recovery in 2 books there.
Absolutely.
So you're an author. Are you? Do you do counseling? Do you do presentations? What's your current life like? What's going on?
Well, I call myself an author and an adventurer, and everyone understands the author bit. So you've written a book or 2. Adventurer, I actually lead adventures throughout the world. Last week, I was leading an adventure in Cuba. So I help others travel to unfamiliar places in hopes to take them out of their comfort zone, challenge them a bit, as I feel that you don't need to have a 1,000-pound tree limb to hit you, to have a revelation, or to look at your world with new eyes. And that travel is one really enjoyable way to do it.
Heidi, that is so interesting. So what you do is you make that travel experience for the people that come with you a transformational experience. You're going to do what you can to have them do some self-realization and to move it to another level of who are they, where are they going to go. Now, do you do that in a very specific didactic kind of way, or how do you actually accomplish that on the journey itself?
I think in travel, there's very few things that you can control. And I think most good travelers do roll with the punches and see the upside of all of these hiccups. So I can't say that I plan this as on day 2 of the tour is when we're going to have this aha moment. Mm-hmm. But for each person over those 7 days, it will happen, if not once, multiple times, that they look at their circumstance differently. Or even I look at my own in a different way, traveling with them. 20 other people. The sites can be the same, but it's a different circumstance and a different vibe that's coming from the group.
So do you process that with them? How does that actually take place? I mean, pardon me for being psychiatric with you, but it's what I do, and I'm curious about the process. So do you actually process it verbally, like in a kind of large group experience, like here's the way this happened and here's the way different people experienced it? How do you actually, what's the process?
I think most of the time it's onesie twosie, a personal conversation with each. But sometimes at group dinners, one question about whether what was your most favorite experience turns into what was the most surprising experience that you had, or what was a preconceived idea that has been debunked over the last 24 hours. And I think that's very interesting how 20 people can have 40 different answers.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. So you're actually helping them get into themselves in a verbal way as well, and helping them articulate for themselves what they're experiencing. So you're developing that thing I was talking about a moment ago, thinking about thinking. You're helping them develop their metacognitive apparatus so they wind up looking more carefully at who they are, where they are, and where they're going to go.
And let's see, other than Cuba this year, I'll be heading back to one of my most favorite countries, Spain, where I studied in university for about 2 years.
Where in Spain do you go?
We're going to Barcelona, which is, it's taking adults to a candy store. It's
we love Spain. My wife and I love Spain. I'm totally with you on that. It was so much fun over there. I mean, the people are so interesting, and so it's a very interesting culture over there. I agree with you. So what did you find interesting, and what do you like about it?
I love the Spanish cultures living outside of their home much more so than they are in their small pisos, their small apartments. That there is much of life that is enjoyed in their neighborhood, on the streets, in the tapa bars or cafeterias and markets, instead of necessarily, well, it's a generalization, but in American cultures, having your large plasma screen TV in your living room, and that's where the majority of the life of that family goes on. In Spain, not such a case unless there is a Real Madrid and Barcelona game on television, and then they're probably at the local cafe watching it anyway.
Yeah. So where else you go? Then we'll do one more place, and I want to really come to a conclusion where I just looked at the time. I'm enjoying talking to you so much, I've just lost track of time. And tell us one more place that you find interesting, that you think is a worthwhile place to go and have that self-examination experience.
Well, I enjoy the outdoors, and actually where I got the idea to write my first book, When All Balls Drop, was in Patagonia, Chile.
Oh my gosh.
So I laid eyes on my first glacier in southern Chile. I hiked the Torres de Paine National Park, and this was all to prove to me that I was well, fully well, after this whole snafu that I had gone through. I had heard from doctors I was well. I had heard from family members that I seemed to be on my way, but I needed to do it for myself. And so I took a solo venture to Patagonia, Chile, and I would recommend both Chile and Argentina to anyone for a wonderful walkabout and inspirational journey.
Well, I'm with you on Patagonia. We've talked about it a few times. I'm a non-recovering fly fisherman, and have dreamed many times of fishing for trout down there in Patagonia, but it hasn't worked. It worked into my schedule. But it sounds like that would be a lot of fun. Well, I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Heidi, and I wanted, for our listeners who've stuck with us and listened to this very interesting story, you've had a major transformational experience in your life, and it really occurred because of your attitude about, your own life's travels and your own crash, as it were. You had a crash and you recovered from the crash, and you had multiple crashes and you recovered because you developed an attitude of you already had an attitude of resilience, but you developed an attitude of I'm going to master this thing, and I'm going to make it happen, and I'm actually going to take myself in my mind new places, even if I can't go there when I'm incapacitated. I think that's really to be commended. It's a tremendous story. So what would you say in closing would be, we're going to have all your links to your website, your books, and so on up there, but do you have any special places that are important to you, or books that are important to you that you think you'd want to share with the audience here that would be helpful to them in their own crisis wherever they are?
For me, writing in a journal was very helpful, as well as finding something that was meditation. And for me, it was walking. For other people, it may be something else. It may be doing something that is gardening. It may be, for me now, being physically well, traveling. What the reason why that I share my story is because I don't necessarily know what is going to be the secret recipe for somebody else, but I know that you can overcome life's obstacles, whatever it may be, 1,000-pound tree limb, a failed marriage or other, and you can thrive in spite of them. And I want people to know that they have that power.
Well, I think that's really great. I mean, I think, me being a medical guy, I keep thinking about, did you have to do anything neurologically? Did you have to do anything with your brain? Did you do any supplements? Did you do any anti-epileptic drugs? Did you have to do anything with your brain recovery that might have been helpful in your recovery? In closing, that just occurred to me.
Off the top of my head, I don't know of anything other than being patient with nature's process.
Yeah. Okay. That's the answer right there. I mean, it didn't sound like you were doing a whole lot of medical things. It sounded like you were doing a number of mind transformational activities that proved productive for you in the long run. Well, thank you so much, Heidi, for coming out this afternoon and down there in Florida. You know, it's funny about these Skype meetings. You can be just anywhere in the world. We just talked to somebody earlier who was in the Netherlands, and it's fun connecting with individuals who are on the same path. And we are definitely on the same path, Heidi, and I really appreciate your taking the time, because it's a service for you to share this experience and give some hope to people and give some direction to people who themselves are lost out there. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. And they need a little metaphoric back rub, even, over a podcast. It can be helpful, because then they can start to think, hey, maybe I can do it. This person had this experience and she's pulled it out. So we encourage the people who are listening, who have a curiosity about your story, to read the book. I mean, read both books. It sounds like you have one which is trauma and another was how you recover. And they sound like they're tied up as a package in a way.
They certainly are, and it all has to do with seeing the upside, and all that has to do with is perspective, and you have the power to flip that switch.
Well, thanks so much, Heidi, for sharing that with us. We do have the power if we go ahead and flip it. That's the truth. Seeing reality in a different way is what we're talking about. So thank you so much. We look forward to talking to you again sometime on the flip side. You have a great day, Heidi.
You too. Wonderful speaking to you.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.